He disappeared in the middle of the day. The answer would only surface 15 years later, and it had been waiting less than a dozen steps from the shoulder of a busy Texas highway, bypassed by cars, trucks, and locals who never imagined what lay just out of sight. 5:37 a.m. Daniel Blake fastens his helmet, fits the straps beneath his chin, glances once at the quiet street in front of his home, and pushes off. He was known for his long solo rides. Not races, not competitions, just steady miles through the open landscape south of Redfield. On paper, there was nothing unusual about that morning. In reality, he had already entered the final hours in which anyone would ever see him alive. Daniel was 29, methodical, and experienced on the road. Friends described him as someone who could plan a route in his head to within a few turns and maintain a steady cadence for hours without pause. Cycling was his version of solitude, a break from his shifts as an EMT, a chance to think, or sometimes not think at all. That morning, a handful of familiar faces noticed him along the route. A farmer heading out to feed livestock saw a lone cyclist pass by, light blue jersey visible against the low horizon. A store clerk at a roadside bait and grocery stop later recalled a courteous customer buying a sports drink, speaking only enough to exchange payment. None of them had reason to think these were the last known moments of a man's public life. The timeline between that purchase and the next confirmed detail would never be fully bridged. Whatever intervened happened fast, between open stretches of pasture, wire fencing, and narrow creek beds, a landscape as empty as it was exposed. By late morning, when Daniel failed to return home as he had told his sister, Rebecca grew concerned. She tried his phone. No signal. After repeated calls went unanswered, she drove out to his planned loop, taking the same road he had started before dawn. Near the intersection with County Road 11, she saw it. Daniel's silver frame road bike leaning neatly against an old, leaning fence post. His small black backpack sat in the dirt beside it, zipped shut. No water spilled, no maps scattered, no scrape in the gravel to suggest force or accident. The bicycle was intact, the chain settled properly, tires still holding air. Police sealed off the immediate area when they arrived. They photographed the scene from multiple angles, the fence stretching in either direction, the pasture beyond, the exact positioning of the bike and bag. Traffic slowed as passing drivers saw the marked units and cones, but few realized this was the site of what would soon become one of Redfield's most enduring mysteries. From the outset, the absence of obvious struggle and the intact state of Daniel's belongings made the case unusual. In most roadside disappearances, there are indicators: skid marks, debris, personal objects dropped or dragged. Here, it looked as though the owner had simply stepped away for a moment, as if expecting to return before the wheels stopped spinning. The unanswered question on day one was the same that would persist for more than a decade. If he left the bike here, where did he go, and why? And why did he not, or could not, return? With the discovery logged and the initial documentation complete, officers prepared to start a search that would stretch across miles, days, and eventually, years. In that moment, none of them knew they were standing within sight of the place where the trail had truly ended. The hours after Daniel Blake's disappearance introduced a shared sense of disbelief that quickly hardened into quiet urgency. By early afternoon, County Road 11 became an improvised command post. Patrol vehicles angled at the shoulder, deputies noting plate numbers of passing trucks, volunteers in faded baseball caps gathering at the edge of trampled grass. A single note pinned above their gathering spot summed up the situation. Bicycle, backpack, nothing else. Missing since morning. Rebecca Blake, Daniel's sister, had insisted on walking the first sweep herself. Guided by habit and the hope that she'd spot some overlooked marker, she retraced his likely path beside officers, searching for anything out of place. A scuff in the dirt, scraps of fabric, even a glint from his lost phone. But the earth around the bicycle gave nothing away. There were no drag marks, no fresh tire tracks diverging from the road, no sign of a scuffle or panic. The scene felt paused, as though waiting for the missing rider to reappear at any second. Within hours, the search took on a life of its own. Neighbors arrived with ATVs and thermal binoculars. Ranchers rode fence lines on horseback, peering through mesquite and tall rye. The police mapped priority sectors onto county plat books. First the ditches and fence lines, then the fields, then the stands of cedar and hackberry beyond the grazed pasture. Volunteers staggered their shifts to keep crews moving as dusk fell, lighting the route with flashlights and lanterns. With daylight fading, trained search and rescue officers brought in 2 canines. The dogs worked methodically from the bicycle outward, noses low, pausing and doubling back along the fence line, crossing back and forth over the shoulder to the graveled turnout. Here, the trail faltered amidst churned dust and overlapping vehicle tracks. The lead handler conferred with deputies. Nothing definitive could be established. Some officers wondered aloud if a passing vehicle had picked up Daniel, voluntarily or not, near this spot. Each possibility was recorded and mapped. Rumors and theories circulated almost immediately. Old friends and shopkeepers whispered about strangers seen on the highway, or odd noises heard from distant pastures a few nights prior. More concrete were the accounts of several witnesses. One farmer, up early to unload feed, remembered seeing Daniel ride past, easily identified by his blue jersey and steady movement along the white line. A local delivery man, heading north to Amarillo, recalled a lone cyclist pausing just beyond the cattle crossing. But in his rearview mirror, the image resolved into a blur before he could be sure. Another, a retired teacher driving south with her husband, mentioned a dark pickup truck parked further down the road, engine running, driver unseen. Deputies took these leads seriously, logging each one in detail. By evening, descriptions of the mysterious pickup, a dark, older model, possibly a Ford, with a dented fender, were cross-checked against vehicle registrations in the county. A few names surfaced. Among them was Robert Kincaid, a man whose previous name in local arrest records triggered quiet concern, though in 2003 there was no direct connection to Daniel. The physical search carried on into the second and third day. Aerial support was secured. A rented Cessna made wide sweeps above the farmland, the pilot noting from the air any sign of ground disturbance, tire tracks, or something brightly colored, lost among the dull grass. On the ground, teams continued to walk gridded patterns, slowly marking cleared on printed maps. Ranch owners opened barns, tool sheds, even old pump houses, sometimes joining in the walking sweeps. Along the creek beds and barbed wire fences, searchers paused often, rooting through carpweed and litter, calling Daniel's name into the heat. Several personal items, wrappers, an old glove, the remains of a soda can, were collected and bagged. None matched Daniel's belongings or the timing of his disappearance. Police paused to reevaluate the working theory. There had been no recent rain to wash away footprints or tire tracks, no extreme wind that might scatter or hide evidence. What lingered was the puzzle: an intact bicycle, a backpack resting beside it, and no plausible means for Daniel to vanish beyond his own volition or outside intervention. Investigators began visiting every address along the southern stretch of Highway 203. Anyone who lived within sightline of the road that morning was interviewed. Doorbells rang at houses tucked among the cotton fields, trailers parked on gravel pads, and the old gas station that doubled as a post office after hours. Nothing new was uncovered. Day after day, the search perimeter widened. Checklists were reviewed, culverts were inspected, cattle ponds dredged, disused oil pump platforms walked around. Attention briefly shifted to the nearest rail yard and grain elevators, then moved on. In every direction, the answer seemed just out of reach. Each negative result only sharpened the question. By the end of the first week, the command post began to scale down. Volunteers grew exhausted, and fewer arrived each morning. Deputies shifted work to paperwork, focusing on collating all gathered material, maps, statements, search logs, into an expanding file. The flurry of early days hardened into a steady, silent stalemate. But what no one realized was that the search, carefully organized and executed by dozens, had come heartbreakingly close. Unseen, just meters from the shoulder, the key evidence waited under a thin crust of red dirt, never guessed at by even the most diligent searchers. The case notes recorded at week's end echoed the exhaustion in the field. Last known sighting, Highway 203, bike and bag at fence, dog trail lost at turnout. Pickup sighted, but not identified. No further developments. The mystery remained stubbornly unbroken, and the file began its slow, reluctant slide into cold case status. Weeks became months. The roads around Redfield lost the clusters of search crews, and the low helicopters cutting slow circles above the pastures. The fence line where Daniel's bicycle had stood was now just another checkpoint for grazing cattle and passing drivers. Daniel Blake was no longer a current concern for most, yet for his sister, for the exhausted detectives, and for a handful of neighbors, his absence continued to press quietly in the background. The official case file, labeled Missing Person, Daniel Blake, grew thick with mapped grids of searched land, printouts from phone carriers, and a ledger of every tip or rumor received. At regular intervals, investigators reopened the notes. A cyclist passing through Amarillo, a blue shirt seen at a rest stop, all checked and dismissed. No bank activity, no phone pings, no stray document tying Daniel to some hidden life elsewhere. Within those records lingered a name that had surfaced briefly in the confusion of early witness accounts: Robert Kincaid. In July 2003, a witness described seeing a dark pickup truck, old, dented, idling near the cattle crossing, roughly half a mile from where Daniel's possessions were found. At the time, it seemed no more than a detail. Local trucks crisscrossed every back road, and Kincaid himself was known in the area, a solitary figure, living off a county spur, driving a battered Ford with mismatched doors. It wasn't until a year later, in 2004, that Kincaid returned to the periphery of local law enforcement interest. After a reported assault on a hitchhiker along a back route east of town, deputies had impounded his pickup for a routine search. Inside, they found several lengths of heavy chain, padlocks, and other metallic objects. The hitchhiker, shaken but not seriously injured, described being threatened and briefly restrained before managing to escape. No charges were filed. Kincaid denied any wrongdoing, and there was no conclusive physical evidence. But the incident was quietly flagged in the county's records. Further background checks revealed that Kincaid had an enduring, if poorly documented, animosity toward cyclists. A minor traffic collision years before had led to bitter arguments with local riders. Some said he blamed bicyclists for rising insurance rates, and more darkly, for accidents both real and imagined. During interviews, former neighbors described a man prone to solitary driving late at night, often returning with cuts and bruises he dismissed as farm injuries. Despite the lingering suspicions, nothing tied Kincaid directly to Daniel's disappearance. He was never formally listed as a suspect, and in the procedural inertia of small-town investigation, names were rarely connected across years without clear evidence, and so his file slowly folded into the growing stack of unresolved questions. Rumors about his behavior circulated in Redfield for years, but never gained the official weight needed to prompt renewed action. As the years passed, Redfield changed. Storefronts closed and reopened. The post office doubled as a coffee shop, and the same stretch of Highway 203 saw new generations of drivers pass the place where Daniel had last stood. For his family, Daniel was preserved in photos and memories. The careful rider, the patient son, the brother who never returned home. They marked anniversaries quietly, staying close to the few neighbors who still remembered his laugh, his methodical way of checking his gear, and his habit of pedaling past the same mile marker every summer weekend. The police, for their part, never closed the case. Every year, new technology promised fresh hope, more detailed cell tower records, expanded DNA databases, new cross-agency platforms for sharing missing person data. But in Daniel's file, the answer never moved past the perimeter, marked by the bike and the bag. All the while, the stretch of ground concealed by grass and wildflowers stayed unchanged. In local legend, it was the place where he vanished, and no one knows why. But buried within every retelling was a motif both tragic and mundane. Sometimes, the truth is obscured not by distance, but by the failure to see what's hidden in plain sight. Toward the end of the first decade, administrators listed Daniel's case as a long-term open file. No new tips arrived. Rebecca's annual calls for information were met with sympathy, but little expectation. The original searchers, now older, sometimes stopped on their own drives past the fence line, glancing one more time at the place where the world seemed to fracture. Robert Kincaid, meanwhile, moved further into isolation. The old pickup, now rust-streaked and swaying on failing springs, was seldom seen except near his rundown property. He had never left Redfield entirely, and despite suspicions, no additional charges were ever filed. As the case approached its 15th year in the archive, one more change would finally upend the silent equilibrium and reveal what neither rumor nor record alone could. 15 years had passed. For Redfield, Daniel Blake's story had faded from daily conversation into the quieter place local mysteries occupy, a name spoken in passing, a cautionary memory attached to a lonely stretch of highway. Yet the ground itself, unchanged for years, still carried the weight of unfinished business. In late August 2018, the Texas Department of Transportation launched a scheduled upgrade of Highway 203, targeting deeper grading and installation of new drainage ditches. Heavy machinery and surveyors flooded the rural corridor for the first time in decades. This was routine work, at least until the first crew, pushing back a swath of clay and rock on the western shoulder, 3 miles south of the old cattle crossing, hit resistance barely beneath the surface. The grader bucked against something dense. Operators halted and took shovels to the spot, expecting scrap metal or a chunk of fence. Instead, they uncovered a fragment of faded blue fabric, the cracked shell of a cycling helmet, and surprisingly, several corroded metallic pieces. Small, irregular shapes with crosshatch marks and torn edges, like hardware from a toolkit and manufactured links. Designed protocols meant any unidentified objects found within construction zones had to be reported. The supervisor dialed the local sheriff's office, and within the hour, patrol cars lined the shoulder, officers marking out a perimeter in caution tape and cones. Curious workers and locals gathered as deputies photographed the scene, bagging each item separately and logging precise GPS coordinates. From the first glance, lead investigators saw what the site implied. The helmet's design matched a model sold at Redfield's cycle shop in 2002, one Daniel had purchased months before his disappearance. The blue fabric mirrored the color and weave of his favorite jersey, described in 2003 statements. The metallic fragments bore fixture patterns consistent with cycling gear, chain links, a flattened piece of bracket, and the remains of a small combination lock. Manual excavation began, forensic specialists sifting through moist soil, scraping every layer for additional evidence. The ground yielded little more, but the clustering of items suggested not random scattering. These had been dropped or forcibly left in a concentrated spot. The absence of animal disturbance or heavy water runoff preserved the scene far better than most outdoor evidence fields. Word spread quietly but immediately. Rebecca Blake received a call from the detective who had maintained annual checks on the file. She was informed of the likely match and invited, along with a victim services advocate, to view the new evidence. Local media ran subdued headlines, focused on factual updates rather than speculation. The find ignited movement within law enforcement circles. The case, dormant for years, was formally reopened. The recovered items made their way to the State Forensics Laboratory in Austin, where textiles, plastics, and metals were analyzed for age, manufacturer, and use. The earliest results confirmed suspicions. Jersey yarn dyed in the same lot as Daniel's purchase. Helmet foam carrying serial numbers from the same production batch. The metallic items, examined under magnification, revealed corrosion patterns consistent with 15 years in local clay and production stamps from a mid-2000s shipment to area stores. Investigators revisited the archived case record. The significance of the discovery site was clear. It lay only steps from the location where a dark pickup truck had been seen idling in 2003 by a witness returning from the cattle auction. That detail, once peripheral, now looked central. The field around the recovery zone was cordoned off for additional sweep. Volunteers, some from the original search, joined officers in carefully walking the ground, not wanting to repeat past mistakes and risk missing evidence. No further traces were found. The answer was singular and stark. Daniel Blake's last location, the truth, had rested just meters from the busy highway, obscured more by routine than by nature. This turning point rekindled hope, but also anxiety. Would the new evidence finally allow investigators to answer the long persistent question, not just for the record, but for the family whose grief had been held in suspense across a decade and a half? At the close of the first day, officers boxed the recovered gear, marking each item according to chain of custody protocol, and documented the field with 3D imaging, panoramic photos, and soil samples. The case, cold since the mid-2000s, was reclassified as active. Files once aging and yellowed were brought under the light of upgraded digital tools, ready for a new phase. One with technology, cross-agency coordination, and modern forensic analytics that had never been available in the days immediately after Daniel's disappearance. For Redfield, and for Daniel's family, the news brought a rare combination: vindication that the searchers had always been close, and the sobering knowledge that the answer had been impossibly near the whole time. In the days ahead, the town would watch as the new investigation turned toward not just closure, but a definitive account of what happened. And finally, who had been responsible. The reopening of the Daniel Blake file in the autumn of 2018 was unlike anything Redfield's police had seen before. Advances in forensic science, digital archiving, and interagency coordination offered new possibilities. The recovered evidence propelled detectives into long days spent comparing, analyzing, and reconstructing not only the path Daniel had traveled, but the shadowed movements of the people he'd never meant to meet. Expert teams at the State Forensic Laboratory commenced work on the blue fabric, helmet fragments, and corroded metal items. Textile scans showed precise dye patterns matching those of a summer 2002 batch, sold exclusively to 2 stores in the region, one where Daniel had been a regular customer. The helmet's fractured shell carried a partial serial code, which, traced through manufacturer records, linked to a delivery made to Redfield Cycle Supply just months before Daniel's disappearance. More revealing was the analysis of the metallic objects from the site. One chain link clearly came from a type of mass-produced lock accessory, retailed in local hardware shops. Another, from bulk shipments of repair tools distributed in North Texas in the early 2000s. Specialists reconstructed the likely usage sequence, determining that these items had not simply fallen. They bore bends and damage consistent with mechanical force and, crucially, signs that they had been employed to restrain or immobilize. While evidence grew, investigators re-interviewed past witnesses. The recollection of a dark pickup idling by the cattle crossing regained new gravity. When shown reference photos from the early 2000s, several locals recognized Robert Kincaid's battered Ford as similar to the vehicle seen that morning. Cell tower records, once too crude to offer more than general location, were now digitally mapped, revealing that Daniel's phone had pinged the sector nearest where the gear was found. The same minute, another device registered. Kincaid's mobile, long dormant but recoverable in provider archives. Detectives deepened their inquiry into Kincaid's background. Old arrest logs revealed a man frequently reported for aggression, especially toward cyclists and transients. His resentment toward riders, documented after a minor collision in the late 1990s, only intensified. Testimonies from former neighbors painted him as increasingly reclusive, with a habit of prowling country roads after midnight. His prior brush with the law, the alleged hitchhiker attack in 2004, recurred in new interviews. The victim described being grabbed and disabled using metal implements, specifically chains and hardware, while inside the pickup's bed. Though charges were dropped due to lack of corroborating evidence, deputies' inventory from the truck listed chain links, padlocks, and abrasive repair tools. The connection was circumstantial but suggestive. Kincaid had the means, motive, and method. Back in Redfield, the investigative team built a timeline overlay. Daniel's confirmed ride south on Highway 203, brief stop for a drink, and disappearance all occurred within a window when Kincaid was known to have been out driving. Inflection points were mapped. The lost trail at the gravel turnout, the proximity of Kincaid's likely route, and historical cell activity all converged around the same section of road. Criminal analysts assessed alternative scenarios, but returned repeatedly to one conclusion. Daniel, unsuspecting, was intercepted, either persuaded to stop through a ruse or forcibly stalled near the turnout. Kincaid employed metallic hardware, as in later attacks, to immobilize him out of sight of passing cars. The items found at the roadwork site were not only Daniel's, but tangible markers of that moment of control. Whether Daniel was taken only a short distance off the shoulder or was held nearby remained unresolved. What no one doubted was the crime occurred within sight of the very place the bike was found. As pieces fit together, the district attorney's office convened a review. Kincaid himself died in 2015, a decade after Daniel's disappearance, his health failing, estate unclaimed. His property, long abandoned, yielded no further evidence. Though he could not face charges, the comprehensive findings, physical, digital, behavioral, led the office to close Daniel's case as a resolved criminal incident. The family was notified in person, meeting with investigators, forensic staff, and victim services advocates. The account was clear. Daniel had likely become a random or targeted victim of Kincaid's pattern. Whether by impulse, animosity, or predatory intent, the result had been equally final. News of the official conclusion reached Redfield first in subdued headlines, then in discussions at the cafe and post office. For some, there was relief. For others, resignation. The mystery had been solved, but not with the satisfaction of justice fulfilled, only with the sober acknowledgement of the facts and of how narrowly the truth had always hovered near the surface. In November 2018, Daniel Blake was laid to rest in the town cemetery. Mourners circled the simple headstone, placing small tokens, photographs, bike gloves, and a miniature blue jersey, alongside the silver-frame bicycle, years preserved in police storage. Rebecca Blake, silent for much of the service, finally spoke. 15 years, and we only had to look a few feet further. The echoes of the case reverberated quietly. For investigators, It meant reviewing cold case protocols, improving early scene documentation, and ensuring that personal histories, even those missing hard proof, were never completely discounted. For the Blake family, it meant closure, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that finally lets it be named. The road that witnessed Daniel's final ride and the hidden turnoff where his fate was sealed remain unchanged beneath the Texas sun. For the people of Redfield, the mystery is over. The lesson is permanent. Sometimes, the hardest secrets are not the ones hidden far away, but those waiting mere steps from view. The official closure of Daniel Blake's case in late 2018 marked the end of a 15-year period of unanswered questions. For family, friends, and everyone involved in the original search, that moment blended the pain of loss with a sense of relief. Clarity was finally reached, and the disappearance was no longer buried behind simply no new evidence. Reaction in Redfield was restrained. Local newspapers published concise, fact-based summaries, a brief timeline of events, the key stages of investigation, and an emphasis on how the case reached its conclusion through persistent archiving and an accidental discovery. Speculation was avoided. Robert Kincaid's name did not surface in headlines, though among townspeople it returned quietly to conversations. The family received a private briefing at county offices. Around a single table sat investigators, prosecutors, forensic experts, and a victim support specialist. Step by step, the chain of events was presented, including photographs of recovered items, cellular records, detailed maps, and the reasoning behind naming Kincaid as the person essentially responsible for what occurred. For Rebecca Blake, this was the moment when personal tragedy finally became a documented reality, with finality. In spring 2019, Daniel's family decided to turn the yearly anniversary of his disappearance into a memorial cycling event. The route traced his last ride, beginning at the roadside store where he made his final purchase, ending at the cemetery, with a pause at the old fence along Highway 203. Residents who had once joined searches returned to spectate or participate. For many, it was a symbolic completion of an interrupted journey. Professionally, the Blake case became part of training material for investigative seminars. Law enforcement officers highlighted several lessons from the outcome. The value of meticulous scene documentation, even when details seem minor. The importance of long-term retention of interviews and seemingly inconsequential evidence. The power of new technology, from reanalyzing old data to cross-referencing records years later. The role of interagency cooperation and keeping suspicion on individuals with patterns, even if no immediate charges are possible. Local protocols were revised, earlier aerial surveys, GPS logging of all evidence, and new procedures for road crews to report any unfamiliar or suspicious findings during grading or construction. By the 2020s, Highway 203 looked unchanged, the long line of asphalt, fences, and pasture land on both sides. But those who remembered the searches of 2003 saw that road as much more than just a route. It now symbolized how the answer to a mystery can wait literally steps from the daily path, sometimes for years. In the town archives, the case is filed as closed, available for educational purposes in cold case methodology. Thus ended a story where a tragic meeting, an empty road, and unusual perseverance in evidence storage all converged to reveal the truth. For the Blake family, the answer came too late to change anything, but just in time to end the uncertainty. And for all who witnessed the closure, one simple, enduring thought remained. Sometimes, truth waits for years, hidden in plain sight. But it can be found if we never stop looking, even in places we thought we already searched.